Hey everyone. Tonight we begin not with a battlefield, but with a door that creaks open in London's East End. Step inside. The air is thick, sweet, acrid, suffocating. Shadows press against the walls. A dozen figures lie sprawled on mattresses, lips parted, pipes glowing like dying coals. One mutters in a low monotone, another stares glassy-eyed into nothing. And from the corner, a woman coughs softly, the sound swallowed by the haze. This is not a nightmare, it is a room the Victorians called an opium den. To some, it was paradise, a place where grief, hunger, and pain dissolved into oblivion. To others, it was hell, where sins old and new clung like smoke to the rafters. Writers like Dickens and Wilde filled these rooms with horror, while reformers called them nests of oriental vice. But the truth was stranger, fewer dens than legend suggests. More ordinary, more human, yet no less haunting. If forgotten corners of history intrigue you, like and subscribe. And tell me what's one hidden vice you think defined an entire era. Now, slow your breath and follow me into the haze of Victorian London. You are there, in the dim, lamp-lit quiet. The faint glow from the ember of a pipe casts a flickering, ethereal light on faces etched by longing or by peace. You might hear the low, almost guttural murmur of a voice, perhaps trying to piece together a fragmented thought, or just drifting through the air like the smoke itself. Imagine the scene that haunted the minds of Victorian authors, the very air thick with the promise of forgetfulness. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, with his keen eye for the shadowed corners of humanity, pictured red embers, little jewels of light in the profound darkness, and figures lying motionless, their lips moving with words that tangled and broke apart. You feel the stillness, broken only by a soft, almost imperceptible cough, or the quiet draw of breath through a long pipe. The great Oscar Wilde, who understood the exquisite pain and beauty of transgression, imagined these very spaces not just as havens from pain, but as dark crucibles where, he suggested, old sins were traded for the madness of new ones. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The air around you seems to hum with that silent exchange, a silent bargain struck between a troubled soul and the sweet release of the drug. You sense the weight of stories, untold and perhaps forgotten, hanging heavy in the air. And then, Charles Dickens, whose pen illuminated the grimy, beating heart of London, drew you into a den in his final, unfinished novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. You see the scene through his eyes, a ragged curtain, perhaps made of burlap or worn velvet, doing little to keep out the pale, reluctant daylight that attempts to pierce the perpetual gloom. It's a struggle, a losing battle, as the light surrenders to the deeper, richer darkness of the smoke. You might make out the figure of a haggard woman, her face softened by the dimness, as she slowly, deliberately lights a pipe. The small flame dances for a moment, illuminating the weariness in her eyes, before the smoke wraps around her, a soft, gray shroud. This is the den as it existed in the Victorian imagination, a crypt of human desires. A place both profoundly oppressive in its stillness and deeply alluring in its promise of escape. You feel the weight of its mystery, its frightening charm. It is a chamber where time slows, where the outside world, with its demands and its disappointments, simply ceases to exist. It offers a kind of dark peace, a stillness that beckons you to let go, to float on the currents of the swirling smoke. And as you breathe it in, or rather, as you imagine breathing it in, you begin to understand the powerful, almost hypnotic draw that brought so many souls to these veiled doorways, seeking refuge from the relentless tide of Victorian life. The quiet hum of the room seems to whisper its secrets, inviting you deeper into its shadowed embrace. Now, step back from the specific, almost theatrical, image of the opium den and let the historical haze settle. You might be surprised to learn that for much of the early 19th century, before the dens became the stuff of sensational tales, opium was as common and readily available as a bottle of aspirin is in your own medicine cabinet today. Imagine your average Victorian household, not in the gritty East End, but perhaps in a quiet, respectable neighborhood. And there, on the family kitchen shelf, right next to the salt jar or the sugar pot, you would find a bottle of laudanum, a simple tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was sold openly, not in hushed back alleys, but in places you visited every day. Your barber might have stocked it, alongside tonics and shaving creams. The confectioner, whose shop windows beckoned with sweets and pastries, could also sell you a small vial. Even the local wine merchant, where you might pick up a bottle of claret for dinner, would likely have laudanum available for purchase. It was ubiquitous, an everyday commodity, woven into the fabric of daily life. Consider its widespread use, particularly among women. It was affectionately, if misleadingly, advertised as the lady's friend. Think of the common ailments of the era: the quiet, often debilitating pain of menstruation, the dramatic fainting spells attributed to hysteria, the excruciating agony of childbirth. For these and countless other discomforts, a spoonful of laudanum was the accepted, often celebrated, remedy. You might have seen a refined lady in a delicate gown, dabbing a few drops on her handkerchief to calm her nerves, or a new mother, exhausted and in pain, reaching for the bottle to find a moment of solace. It wasn't hidden. It was a societal expectation, a silent support for the burdens of Victorian womanhood. And then, tragically, think of the children. Imagine a crying infant, restless with colic, or a small child racked by a persistent cough. For these little ones, a popular concoction called Godfrey's cordial was readily administered. This seemingly innocuous syrup was a mix of opium, treacle, and water. You can almost see a weary mother, desperate for a moment of peace, spooning this sweet, calming liquid into her child's mouth, believing it to be a harmless cure for their discomfort or a simple means to induce a peaceful sleep. The irony is haunting: what was given with loving intent often led to quiet, insidious dependence. So, the image of the opium den, while powerful, represents only a fraction of the story. For countless Victorians, the drug was not found in shadowed back rooms, but in the very heart of their homes. A quiet constant, a readily available comfort. You can feel the weight of its widespread presence, not as a moral failing for most, but as a practical solution to pain and discomfort. A household staple that carried with it an unseen, unfolding consequence. The acceptance was so profound, so deeply ingrained, that its dangers remained largely unexamined for far too long, lurking beneath the veneer of everyday normalcy. Beyond the common household remedy, opium held a different, more ethereal allure for a select group: the poets, the writers, the dreamers of the Victorian age. For them, it wasn't merely a pain reliever, it was a key, they believed, to unlocking the hidden chambers of the mind, a way to traverse landscapes of imagination untouched by waking thought. You might imagine a solitary figure at a candlelit desk, the wick flickering softly, casting dancing shadows on a half-written page. Around them, the faint, sweet scent of opium smoke curls upwards, a silent, almost invisible muse. Consider Samuel Taylor Coleridge, a figure of immense literary power and profound inner turmoil. It is said that he penned one of his most iconic and enigmatic poems, Kubla Khan, entirely from an opium-induced vision. You can almost feel the surge of unbidden imagery, the rush of sublime, fantastical landscapes, the vibrant colors and sounds that cascaded through his mind, demanding to be captured on paper. The words would have flowed, perhaps not from conscious effort, but from a deeper, more primal wellspring, stirred by the drug's influence. His mind, set adrift on an opium sea, conjured Xanadu, a pleasure dome of wondrous design, a place where sunlit domes and caves of ice coexisted in impossible harmony. Then there is Thomas de Quincey, whose Confessions of an English Opium Eater, published in 1821, laid bare the intoxicating, yet ultimately terrifying, journey into the opium dream. Imagine him, a scholar, a man of letters, seeking solace from ailments, only to discover a world both glorious and ghastly. He describes it as holding the keys to paradise, a boundless realm of heightened sensation, profound insight, and intoxicating beauty. You might feel the expansion of thought, the dissolution of mundane worries, the sense of an infinite capacity for understanding and joy. The world, through opium, became sharper, more vivid, brimming with unexpected meaning. Yet, this paradise had its shadowy twin, a hell of its own making. De Quincey also recounted the descent into horrifying nightmares, where the exquisite pleasure curdled into agonizing dread. Imagine waking from a deep, drug-induced slumber, only to find your mind filled with grotesque, persistent images, monkeys, parrots, and cockatoos, their eyes staring fixedly, mockingly, at you, their forms distorted and menacing. You can almost feel the chill of that cold dread, the sense of being trapped within a dreamscape that refused to release you. A vivid, relentless terror that clung to the edges of your waking consciousness. This dual nature, the ecstasy and the torment, defined his experience and colored his influential work. And they were not alone. Poets and writers like Lord Byron, known for his romantic excesses, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, whose delicate health often led her to seek relief in laudanum, also quietly indulged. Sir Walter Scott, too, navigated the hazy boundary between creative inspiration and the drug's pervasive influence. You can sense the quiet desperation, the secret hope that within the comforting fog of opium, they might find not just oblivion, but clarity, not just escape, but revelation. For these literary giants, the opium dream was a complex, often contradictory companion, a muse that whispered both beauty and terror into their artistic souls, forever binding their words to the drug's enigmatic power. Now, let's shift our gaze from the individual's private struggle to the vast, intricate tapestry of empire. And you'll discover that the story of opium is inextricably linked to something as seemingly innocent as a cup of tea. Britain, by the 19th century, was utterly devoted to tea. Imagine the ritual, twice or even thrice a day. Across every strata of society, the gentle clink of porcelain, the comforting warmth of the brew, the quiet murmur of conversation over a steaming cup. Tea was not just a drink. It was the very cornerstone of national culture, a beloved daily comfort that permeated every home, from the grandest country estate to the humblest worker's cottage. But this beloved habit came at a significant cost. For generations, Britain had been importing vast quantities of tea from China, and the Chinese, proud of their self-sufficiency, demanded payment in silver. Picture the endless streams of precious silver flowing out of the British treasury, across vast oceans, into the coffers of the Qing dynasty. This relentless drain of wealth was so profound, so alarming, that the Chinese, with a dry, almost mocking accuracy, referred to their land as the graveyard of silver for the British. You can almost feel the unease growing in London, the deep concern among economists and politicians as the nation's silver reserves dwindled, threatening the very stability of the empire's finances. To counter this debilitating trade imbalance, Britain sought a product, a commodity, that China would buy in return. And what did they find? Opium, cultivated in British India. Imagine the vast fields of poppies, their delicate flowers hiding the potent resin that would soon be collected, processed, and then illicitly smuggled into China. The British East India Company, and later independent traders, became the architects of this dark enterprise, pushing the drug into Chinese ports with relentless efficiency. The sheer hypocrisy of the situation was not lost on critics, even at the time. You can visualize the scathing satirical prints that circulated through London's streets, bold and unforgiving in their indictment. Imagine seeing an image, rendered with sharp lines and biting caricature, depicting an Englishman, perhaps a caricature of the British government itself, forcefully offering opium to the Chinese emperor. In the foreground, or at his feet, you might see the ghostly outlines of prostrate figures, representing the countless Chinese lives already lost or ruined by addiction. Behind the figures, looming large and ominous, stand British soldiers, bayonets fixed, their presence a silent, menacing threat. It was an image that laid bare the brutal reality. The opium trade was not a gentle exchange of goods, but an act of economic coercion, backed by military might. So, for every teacup raised in Britain, for every quiet afternoon spent sipping the comforting brew, imagine its dark mirror a chest of potent opium, packed tight and shipped eastward, an insidious payload destined to balance the books, but at the cost of an entire nation's well-being. The gentle aroma of tea in a British parlor was, in a chilling sense, perfumed by the bitter, acrid smoke of opium far across the globe, binding two distant cultures in a web of dependency and devastating conflict. The quiet accumulation of silver, the beloved ritual of tea, and the insidious trade of opium were all currents building towards an inevitable storm. You can almost feel the tension mounting across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the air growing heavy with unresolved grievances and imperial ambitions. The year is 1839, and the Chinese Empire, long insulated and proud, had finally reached its breaking point. Commissioner Lin Zexu, a man of unwavering resolve, was dispatched to Canton, the heart of the illicit opium trade. His mission to eradicate the foreign poison that was bleeding his nation dry and corrupting its people. Imagine the sheer scale of his defiance. Lin Zexu demanded that British merchants surrender their opium stores, and when they did, reluctantly, under threat, he didn't just confiscate it, he destroyed it. Picture 20,000 chests of opium, massive wooden containers filled with the sticky, dark resin, being hauled out, mixed with salt and lime, and then, dramatically, dumped into the sea. You can almost see the waters of Canton Harbor turning a deep, unsettling black. Not with the clean indigo of the sea, but with the polluting, staining substance of the drug. It was a powerful, symbolic act. A line drawn in the sand, or rather, in the water, by a proud nation determined to protect its sovereignty. But this act of defiance was met with swift, brutal retaliation. The British, outraged by the destruction of their valuable property and the perceived affront to their commercial rights, declared war. This was the First Opium War, from 1839 to 1842. You can almost hear the roar of the new British steamships, their powerful engines churning, their cannons unleashing devastating fire upon the traditional Chinese junks and coastal defenses. It was a stark clash between an old, established empire and the cutting edge of industrial and military might. The British forces, with their superior technology and disciplined tactics, quickly overwhelmed the Qing defenses. The outcome was a humiliating defeat for China, codified in the Treaty of Nanking. Imagine the signing of a document that forever altered the destiny of a nation. Hong Kong, a strategic island, was ceded to Britain, becoming a vital outpost for British trade and influence. Several other Chinese ports were forced open to foreign trade, stripping China of its long-held autonomy. Of course. There were the crushing silver indemnities, vast sums of money that further drained the already weakened Chinese treasury. You can almost feel the weight of that defeat, the heavy burden of forced concessions, the deep humiliation felt by the Chinese people. But the story didn't end there. The second chapter of this bitter conflict, the Second Opium War, raged from 1856 to 1860. This time, British and French forces joined together, marching inland, their path marked by destruction, their ultimate target Beijing, the ancient capital. You can imagine the shock, the disbelief, as foreign armies entered the sacred heart of the empire. They looted and then burned the magnificent summer palace, a sprawling complex of imperial gardens and exquisite architecture, reducing centuries of cultural heritage to ash. It was an act of deliberate cultural destruction, a chilling symbol of unchecked imperial power. By the end of the century, the consequences for China were catastrophic. You might picture the devastating statistics. An estimated 90 million Chinese people, perhaps more, had become addicted to opium. Their lives, their families, their futures consumed by the drug. The Qing dynasty, once a mighty empire, was fatally weakened, its authority undermined, its economy crippled, its people suffering. The black seas of Canton, stained with resin, had been an omen, signaling the profound and lasting impact of an addiction forced upon a nation, changing the course of history for generations to come. As the 19th century progressed, and the shadows of the Opium Wars lingered over the vast Chinese empire, closer to home, in the bustling heart of London, another narrative was taking shape. You find yourself now in the East End, in a district called Limehouse. This area, with its labyrinthine alleyways, its docks, and its transient populations of sailors and immigrants, became the fertile ground for sensational stories. Newspapers and popular novels of the era painted Limehouse as a veritable hell, a crucible of crime and exotic vice, with opium dens at its very heart, lurking like sinister, glowing eyes in the smoky gloom. Imagine the headlines, the breathless prose, the illustrations depicting shadowy figures, whispers of dark deeds, and the ever-present, cloying scent of opium hanging heavy in the air. This was the Limehouse of public imagination, a place where dangerous foreigners plotted, where moral decay festered, and where the oriental vice of opium was said to be spreading like a plague. You might visualize a dingy alleyway, reimagined in print as a tangled labyrinth of sin, each turn leading to a deeper, more profound darkness. The narrative was powerful, thrilling, and deeply ingrained in the popular consciousness. But now, let us peel back the layers of sensationalism and step into the actual reality. A reality that often proved far less dramatic than the fiction it inspired. The truth was, compared to the sprawling networks of dens in China or even later in America, East London's Limehouse district was home to only a handful of small, often unassuming opium dens. You might walk past one, barely noticing its discreet entrance, nestled between a modest shop and a residential dwelling. These were not the sprawling, terrifying labyrinths of vice depicted in novels. They were often cramped, quiet rooms, serving a very specific, limited clientele. Who frequented these places? Primarily sailors, newly arrived from distant ports, often with their own supply of opium acquired abroad, and dock workers, their bodies aching from strenuous labor, their lives often hard and uncertain, seeking a brief respite from the relentless grind. You can almost picture them, men weary from the sea, or from the heavy lifting on the docks, looking for a moment of quiet oblivion, a temporary escape from the physical and emotional toll of their demanding lives. Their needs were simple: a place to lie down, a pipe, and a few hours of peace. The novelist Walter Besant, a contemporary observer, actually visited these dens, perhaps expecting the dark theatrics portrayed in the newspapers. He came with an eager, almost morbid curiosity. And what did he find? You can almost hear the disappointment in his voice, his description deflating the grand myths. He reported, rather flatly, that there was no horror, only a choking smell and a screeching instrument. Imagine that anticlimax: no sinister figures, no dramatic confessions, just the pervasive odor of the smoke and perhaps the thin, reedy sound of a Chinese musical instrument, adding a touch of melancholic atmosphere to an otherwise mundane scene. The reality, it seems, was far more ordinary, far more human, and arguably far more tragic in its quiet desperation than any sensationalized story could convey. The truly haunting aspect was not the imagined grandiosity of sin, but the quiet, almost invisible suffering of those who sought refuge within these modest, smoky rooms, trying to find a momentary pause from the relentless pace and harsh realities of their daily lives. As you journey deeper into the Victorian-era's relationship with opium, a stark, unsettling truth begins to emerge: the very nature of addiction, and society's judgment of it, was profoundly influenced by class and, disturbingly, by race. You begin to sense the deep vein of hypocrisy that ran through the heart of Victorian society, where the same substance, the same escape, was viewed through entirely different lenses depending on who was using it. Imagine, for a moment, an aristocratic gentleman, perhaps a lord or a wealthy merchant, reclining in his lavish study. On his polished mahogany desk, nestled among leather-bound books and ornate inkwells, sits a small, elegant bottle of laudanum. For him, its use was often framed as a refined habit, a private indulgence, perhaps a sophisticated means of managing a nervous disposition or a persistent migraine. You might even hear hushed whispers of its use enhancing creativity, a quiet, almost poetic, pursuit The image is one of control, of quiet contemplation, of a gentleman engaging with a substance that, in his hands, became a mark of gentle eccentricity rather than moral failure. His addiction, if it existed, was a private matter, shielded by wealth and status, often dismissed as a harmless foible. Now, imagine the same bottle, perhaps chipped and worn, on the rough, unvarnished table of a working-class laborer in a cramped, damp tenement. Here, the narrative shifts dramatically. For the working-class user, whether it was a factory hand seeking relief from relentless pain, a weary seamstress trying to stay awake for endless hours, or a mother numbing the cries of her hungry children, their use of opium was denounced as immoral, degenerate, a sign of weakness and vice. You can almost hear the moralizing pronouncements from pulpits and through the pages of newspapers. These were not refined habits, but scandalous addictions, a direct consequence of moral decay, a threat to the very fabric of society. The very same bottle of laudanum, innocent on a gentleman's desk, became a shameful symbol of a laborer's downfall. You feel the sting of this double standard, the crushing weight of societal judgment falling disproportionately on those already struggling for survival. This class-based hypocrisy was further complicated and intensified by pervasive racist tropes. As Chinese immigrants began to settle in London, often in areas like Limehouse, they were almost immediately cast as insidious corruptors, bringing with them a new and dangerous form of vice. The opium dens, whether few or many, became focal points for a widespread moral panic, fueled by xenophobia. You might imagine propaganda posters, subtle at first, then increasingly overt, depicting Chinese figures as sinister, their influence portrayed as a dark, spreading stain. The narrative was clear: these immigrants were not just users of opium, they were actively spreading it, luring innocent Victorians into their smoky lairs, infecting the pure English populace with an Oriental vice. This was not just about the drug, it was about fear of the other, fear of cultural impurity, fear of perceived threats to the established order. You can feel the underlying anxiety, the quiet prejudice that simmered beneath the surface of polite society, bubbling up into a public discourse that demonized a minority group for a problem that was, ironically, already deeply ingrained in British culture, albeit in a different, more accepted form. The haze of opium, it seems, was not uniformly gray. For some, it was a gentle mist. For others, a suffocating, judgmental fog. As the Victorian-era drew to a close, and the whispers of a new century began to stir, the public perception of opium, and indeed of addiction itself, started to undergo a significant transformation. You can sense a shift in the air, a movement away from the casual acceptance that once defined the drug's presence in every household. This change was driven by two powerful forces: the quiet advancements of medical science and the loud, often shrill, clamor of moral panic. Imagine the quiet revolution occurring in the medical field. The late 19th century saw the development of new synthetic pain relievers, most notably aspirin. This remarkable new medication, effective and widely available, offered a powerful alternative to opium derivatives for managing everyday aches and pains, fevers, and headaches. For the wealthy and the middle class, aspirin provided a convenient and respectable path away from the daily reliance on laudanum. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief as people discovered a new ladies' friend that lacked the stigma and the long-term dependency associated with opium. This scientific innovation, quiet in its arrival, had a profound impact, subtly eroding the everyday necessity of the older drug. Simultaneously, a more forceful and public movement began to gain momentum, the anti-opium campaigns. These were complex, multi-layered crusades. On one hand, they represented genuine medical reform, a growing understanding of addiction as a debilitating condition rather than a mere moral failing. Doctors and reformers, armed with new knowledge, began to advocate for stricter controls and greater public awareness of opium's dangers. You can picture them, earnest and passionate, speaking out against the drug's widespread use, particularly among vulnerable populations. But intertwined with this legitimate concern was a darker current, a potent moral panic, often tinged with xenophobia. Popular culture, ever a mirror and amplifier of societal anxieties, found a new villain in the Oriental vice. Imagine the rise of sensational fictional characters, none more iconic than Sax Rohmer's Dr. Fu Manchu. You can almost see him a figure of cunning malevolence, with his sinister mustache and piercing eyes, embodying all the Victorian fears of Eastern influence. He was portrayed not just as a criminal mastermind, but as a direct threat to Western civilization, a purveyor of opium and other dark secrets designed to corrupt and undermine. His very presence in popular stories fueled the idea that opium danger emanated specifically from the East, an insidious poison creeping into the heart of London. This narrative was powerfully reinforced by propaganda posters. Imagine the stark, fear-mongering images plastered on walls across the city's dark, shadowy figures with Oriental features, often with slanting eyes and long fingernails, offering opium to unsuspecting Westerners. The messages were clear and urgent, warning against the Oriental vice, portraying Chinese immigrants not as victims of colonial trade, but as active agents of moral corruption. You can feel the wave of suspicion and fear that these images would have generated, further solidifying the link between opium, Chinese people, and a perceived threat to Victorian values. So, the landscape shifted. What was once a common household remedy became, for many, a foreign contagion. The opium den, once a quiet retreat, was now a den of villainy. The scientific progress that offered relief from pain paradoxically intensified the moral condemnation of the drug, particularly when it was linked to the other. The haze of opium remained, but its meaning had fundamentally changed, becoming a symbol of both legitimate medical concern and deeply ingrained societal anxieties. Our journey now carries us across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, to a land still relatively young but rapidly expanding America, and specifically, the vibrant, often turbulent city of San Francisco. As the 19th century progressed into the 1860s, a new chapter in the story of opium dens unfolded here, within the bustling, mysterious confines of Chinatown. You can almost hear the cacophony of sounds, the blend of cultures, the distinct aroma of spices and herbs mingling with something darker, something sweeter and more cloying. Imagine the descriptions penned by eager, often horrified, American journalists and social reformers who ventured into these hidden spaces. Their words painted vivid, almost gothic. Pictures rooms like sepulchres, they wrote, describing the profound silence, the sense of being in a place where life was suspended, where bodies lay motionless. You can almost feel the chill, the stillness of these chambers, illuminated only by the feeble yellow lamplight, struggling to pierce the choking smoke. The air would have been thick, almost palpable, with the scent of burning opium, and through it, you would discern figures, men lying like corpses, their faces slack, their eyes glazed over, seemingly lost to the world. It was a potent image, one that resonated with both fascination and fear in the American public imagination. By the 1890s, the scale of opium use in San Francisco's Chinatown had reached significant proportions. You might try to visualize the sheer number: approximately 300 dens dotted throughout the district, each one a small, self-contained world of oblivion. These dens, it was estimated, served around 3,000 hardcore opium fiends. The term itself speaks volumes, reflecting the moral panic and the intense societal condemnation that had now firmly attached itself to the drug and its users. You can sense the desperation that would drive individuals to such a consuming addiction, the complete surrender to the drug's pull. However, a dramatic and unforeseen event brought about a sudden, violent end to many of these establishments. On April 18, 1906, the earth itself shook. Imagine the terror, the chaos, the roaring flames that swept through San Francisco after the devastating earthquake. Chinatown, with its densely packed wooden structures, was particularly vulnerable. You can picture the inferno, the homes and businesses collapsing, the streets filled with rubble and smoke, the very ground beneath your feet trembling. The 1906 earthquake and subsequent fire effectively wiped out a vast number of the opium dens. A dramatic, almost apocalyptic cleansing that altered the landscape of addiction in the city. In the decades that followed, from the 1910s into the 1920s, a nationwide wave of anti-drug legislation and moral fervor swept across America. Federal crackdowns became increasingly common and aggressive. And to hammer home the message, public burnings of confiscated opium were staged, often as grand civic rituals. Imagine the scene: large crowds gathering, faces upturned, watching as police officers, perhaps with stern, resolute expressions, piled mountains of the dark, sticky drug into roaring bonfires. You can almost smell the acrid, sickening odor of burning opium mingling with the smoke, rising into the sky. It was a symbolic funeral pyre for Chinatown vice, a dramatic visual statement of a nation cleansing itself of what it now perceived as a profound moral corruption. These public spectacles served as powerful warnings, ensuring that the legacy of opium dens in America would be one of shame, fear, and ultimate eradication. And so, our journey through the shadowy world of Victorian opium comes to its close, leaving behind not just empty rooms, but a lingering haze of memory and consequence. You might feel the weight of history settle around you, the echoes of lives lived and lost, empires shaped and broken. The story of opium is not just about a drug. It is a profound testament to the intricate, often brutal, interplay of economics, culture, power, and human vulnerability. For China, the legacy was catastrophic. Imagine the tens of millions of lives devastated by addiction, entire families ruined, generations lost to the drug's insidious grip. The once proud Qing Empire, already struggling with internal strife, found itself fatally weakened, not just by military defeat, but by the systemic poisoning of its own people. You can sense the deep, enduring humiliation that settled upon the nation, a scar left by forced trade and foreign aggression, a wound that festered for decades and shaped the very course of its 20th century history. The economic and social fabric of a vast civilization was torn apart by the relentless push of a single commodity. In the West, particularly in Britain and America, the physical opium dens themselves largely vanished. Stricter laws, new medical alternatives, and relentless moral campaigns slowly, systematically, eradicated them from the urban landscape. The doors closed, the pipes cooled, and the lingering smoke eventually dissipated into the air. But something else remained. Something far more tenacious and pervasive, the literature and the stereotypes. You can feel their continued presence, even today, in the way Oriental characters were often portrayed in fiction, or in the very notion of a den of vice. The images of mysterious, shadowed rooms and sinister figures with their pipes became etched into the collective imagination, a powerful, often inaccurate, cultural shorthand for exotic danger and moral decay. And so, we return to our starting point, to that cramped room, that quiet space in the East End, or perhaps in San Francisco. Look around you now. It is, perhaps, just an ordinary room, once filled with smoke and the quiet desperation of human beings. In the harsh light of history, it might appear almost dull, stripped of the sensationalism that once clung to it, like the acrid scent of the drug itself. Yet, in the Western imagination, in the stories we tell, in the cultural narratives that endure, this ordinary, smoky space transformed into something far more potent. It became a haunted chamber, a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred, where anxieties about class, race, and foreign influence coalesced into a potent symbol. It stands, even now, as a ghostly emblem of a century's complex obsessions with pain and pleasure, with control and surrender, with the allure of oblivion and the terrifying cost of an empire built on the haze of addiction. And perhaps, somewhere in that quiet memory, the faint scent of that sweet, acrid smoke still lingers, a soft whisper of a powerful past. We begin not with an explosion, but with the lingering quiet after a storm, and the subtle tensions that continue to brew. The air, heavy and humid in the treaty ports of southern China, carried with it the distant, rhythmic creak of wooden ships, a sound that for many was a constant, gentle reminder of a profound and unsettling change. It had echoed ever louder since the conclusion of the First Opium War, an event that had deeply scarred the venerable Qing dynasty. China, once confident in its self-sufficiency, had been defeated, not just on the battlefield, but in its very understanding of the world. The grand illusion of its insular empire, its perceived centrality in all human affairs, had been shattered. One could almost feel the weight of that defeat, a palpable tension in the quiet courtyards and bustling markets. It wasn't merely the loss of territory or the forced opening of a few port cities. It was a deeply personal wound to the national psyche. Imagine the subtle shift in the demeanor of the common people. A quiet resignation, perhaps, in the eyes of an elderly scholar, or a newfound, wary curiosity in the young apprentice sweeping dust from a shop front. The foreign presence, though concentrated in designated zones, was a persistent, low hum, an unfamiliar melody in the ancient harmony of Chinese life. The terms of the treaties signed in the aftermath of that first conflict had been harsh, forcing open doors that China had long kept shut. New treaty ports had been established, like Guangzhou, Xiamen, and Shanghai, where foreign merchants and diplomats could reside and trade with a degree of extraterritoriality, living under their own laws, not China's. Yet, even these significant concessions, extracted under duress, were proving problematic. Many of the promises inherent in these agreements, or perhaps more accurately, the expectations they bred on the foreign side remained unfulfilled. There was a quiet, seething frustration among the Western powers. They felt that China was dragging its feet, subtly resisting the full implementation of these new, intrusive arrangements. The perceived slowness, the cultural barriers, and China's innate desire to maintain control all contributed to a deepening sense of unease. Across the vast expanse of the ocean, in the bustling industrial heart of Great Britain, a different kind of quiet struggle was unfolding, one rooted in the delicate balance of international commerce. The British public had developed an insatiable thirst for tea, a delicate, fragrant beverage that had become an indispensable part of daily life. From the grandest drawing rooms to the humblest cottages, the very air in London seemed to carry the faint, comforting aroma of brewing tea. This immense demand, however, created a significant trade deficit. Britain was buying vast quantities of tea, fine silks, and intricate porcelains from China. But China, in its self-sufficiency, had little desire for British manufactured goods. Gold and silver, in vast quantities, flowed out of British coffers and into China's. This imbalance was a quiet, persistent worry for the British exchequer. A subtle gnawing anxiety beneath the surface of imperial grandeur. How could one possibly balance such an uneven flow of wealth? The answer, for many, was found in a single, potent commodity: opium. Cultivated in the fertile lands of British India, opium became the silent, insidious solution to this financial dilemma. Its widespread use within China created a reverse flow of silver, restoring a semblance of balance to the ledgers, but at a devastating human cost. Imagine the quiet despair in the opium dens, the hollow coughs, the vacant stares of those caught in its grasp. The scent of its smoke, once a symbol of illicit pleasure, became for many the smell of quiet ruin, a pervasive sorrow that stretched from the wealthy cities to the rural villages. And then, as if the existing tensions weren't enough, another, more tumultuous force arose within China itself: the Taiping rebels. Their movement, a vast, millenarian uprising, swept across the countryside like a gathering storm, marked by fervent religious zeal and brutal violence. Among their many destructive acts, they targeted and destroyed immense stocks of opium, viewing it as a foreign corrupting influence, a symbol of the Qing dynasty's weakness and their moral decay. These acts, though aimed at purging a societal ill, paradoxically served only to worsen the already strained relations with the Western powers. The quiet frustration in the British trading houses turned into outright anger. The destruction of these valuable, albeit illicit, goods was seen as a direct assault on their economic interests, further fueling the embers of conflict that lay smoldering beneath the surface. The stage, subtly and inevitably, was being set for another confrontation, a slow, methodical march towards renewed hostility. The air over the Pearl River Delta, usually alive with the quiet chatter of merchants and the gentle lapping of waves against countless sampans, held a new, sharper edge in late 1856. The delicate balance, already teetering, was about to be irrevocably disrupted by an incident that, on the surface, seemed minor, almost insignificant, yet carried the full weight of imperial pride and burgeoning resentment. Picture the scene on a calm October morning. The vessel in question was a small lorcha, a type of Chinese sailing junk, named the Arrow. It was a humble working ship, designed for coastal trade, but its fate was anything but humble. While it was crewed by Chinese sailors, it flew a British flag and had been registered in Hong Kong, then a nascent British colony. This registration, however, had expired. On that quiet morning, as the sun began to cast long shadows across the water, Chinese authorities, under the jurisdiction of Governor Ye Mingchen, acted swiftly and decisively. They boarded the Arrow, arrested its crew, and lowered the British flag. It was a precise, almost clinical operation, carried out with an air of authority and a quiet confidence. From the Chinese perspective, this was a legitimate act. They believed the ship was engaged in piracy and smuggling, and its British registration was merely a convenience, a facade. For Governor Yi, a man known for his staunch conservatism and unwavering anti-foreign stance, it was a quiet assertion of China's sovereign rights, a necessary demonstration of strength against perceived foreign encroachment. One could almost hear the rustle of his silk robes as he gave the order, a silent act of defiance against the growing tide of Western influence. However, from the British viewpoint, the act was far from legitimate. It was interpreted not merely as an arrest, but as a grave insult, a direct challenge to their imperial prestige and their growing presence in the region. The lowering of the British flag, in particular, was seen as an unforgivable affront, a symbolic gesture designed to undermine their authority. The news traveled quickly through the foreign concessions, sparking murmurs of outrage that soon escalated into shouts of indignation. For the British, Hong Kong registration, regardless of its expired status, conferred British protection. To violate that was to violate Britain itself. The quiet indignation within the British consulate soon boiled over into a demand for immediate and unequivocal satisfaction. The man most vocal in this escalating crisis was Harry Parkes, the British consul in Guangzhou, Canton. Parkes was a figure of restless ambition, a man driven by a desire to make a name for himself and to advance British interests with an almost unyielding zeal. He saw the Arrow incident not as a standalone event, but as an opportunity, a crucial leverage point to force China to open up further, to fully implement the terms of the previous treaties, and perhaps even to secure new concessions. His voice, though not loud in the physical sense, carried the resonant weight of imperial conviction. One could imagine him pacing his office, the quiet scratch of his pen as he drafted sharp, demanding dispatches, pushing for a strong response. He was convinced that only a firm hand, a display of overwhelming force, would truly command China's respect and compliance. And so, the quiet moments of diplomatic posturing gave way to the inevitable thud of cannon fire. In swift retaliation, the Royal Navy, acting on Parkes's insistence and the broader indignation, began to shell Canton. The peaceful rhythm of the city was shattered by the distant, booming roar of naval guns, followed by the terrifying whistle of shells arcing through the air, and then the sickening crunch of collapsing buildings. Smoke billowed over the city, and the cries of its inhabitants mingled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. This was not a limited engagement. It was a deliberate act of intimidation, designed to inflict damage and send an unmistakable message. The intention was clear: Britain would not tolerate perceived slights to its imperial rights. The Arrow incident, a seemingly small spark, had ignited a much larger, more destructive fire, drawing the venerable, ancient city of Canton into the brutal crucible of modern warfare. The initial quiet, the subtle provocations, had now given way to the undeniable clamor of conflict. Across the vast oceans, within the hallowed, often hushed halls of the British Parliament, the news of escalating hostilities in China arrived not with a sudden clamor, but with a quiet, unsettling ripple. Initially, there was a palpable reluctance, a deep-seated opposition to engaging in another distant war. The very thought of it seemed to wear on the collective conscience of the nation's representatives. Whispers of dissent mingled with the rustle of parliamentary papers. Many members of Parliament felt that Britain was already stretched thin, its resources and attention consumed by a far more pressing and devastating crisis unfolding concurrently in another jewel of the Empire India. The specter of the Sepoy Mutiny hung heavy in the air. Reports, often harrowing and unsettling, detailed the fierce, bloody rebellion that had erupted across the Indian subcontinent. It was a conflict of immense scale, requiring vast numbers of troops, immense financial outlay, and a profound emotional toll. The idea of diverting precious resources, of sending even more British soldiers to a distant land like China, seemed irresponsible, even reckless, to many. The moral arguments against the Arrow incident, framed as an act of aggression against a seemingly minor affront, also resonated deeply with a segment of the political class. There was a quiet, persistent voice advocating for diplomacy, for restraint, for a focus on the pressing matters closer to home. Yet, standing firmly against this tide of caution and opposition was the towering figure of Prime Minister Lord Palmerston, an elder statesman with a formidable will and a reputation for bold, decisive action. Palmerston harbored few doubts. He embodied the unyielding spirit of Victorian imperial expansion. In his view, the Arrow incident was not merely an insult. It was a symptom of China's inherent barbarism and its stubborn refusal to acknowledge what he perceived as the rightful demands of civilized nations. His voice, though perhaps not physically raised, carried the weight of conviction, echoing through the chamber. He painted China as a recalcitrant, backward nation that needed to be taught a stern lesson, to be brought, forcibly if necessary, into the established order of global trade and diplomacy. Palmerston's rhetoric was stark, often dismissive, employing language that would today be seen as profoundly offensive, but which resonated with many in his time. He argued that the Chinese were inherently untrustworthy, that their legal system was arbitrary, and that their resistance to free trade was an affront to progress. The quiet dignity of Chinese culture, its ancient traditions, were dismissed as mere obstacles to be overcome. For Palmerston, the underlying issue was not just the Arrow incident itself, but the broader principle of unchallenged British authority and commercial access. Faced with significant parliamentary opposition, Palmerston made a bold, almost audacious move. Instead of yielding, he called for a general election. It was a strategic gamble, a direct appeal to the British public, circumventing the cautious voices within Westminster. He framed the issue not as a minor colonial dispute, but as a matter of national honor and economic necessity. He presented a narrative of British strength and unwavering resolve in the face of foreign obstruction. The election campaign, though not as frenetic as modern ones, still stirred a quiet tension across the nation. Pamphlets were printed, speeches were delivered, and public opinion slowly began to shift. And when the votes were cast and counted, Palmerston emerged victorious. His gamble had paid off. The election results provided him with a clear, undeniable mandate from the British people to prosecute the war. The quiet debates and moral qualms within Parliament were largely silenced. The re-election of Palmerston, a man who represented unwavering imperial ambition, solidified the nation's resolve. It was a somber triumph for those who believed in a strong, assertive foreign policy. The path to war, once lined with hesitant questions, was now cleared. paved with the quiet, firm resolve of a newly elected government. The distant sounds of conflict in China, once met with skepticism, now seemed almost inevitable, a grim necessity blessed by the will of the people. As the distant drumbeat of war intensified in the east, a subtle and intricate dance of power began to unfold on the global stage. It was a choreography of alliances, strategic maneuvers, and calculated neutrality, all performed with a quiet, almost imperceptible grace by the great European powers. The conflict in China, though seemingly localized, became a nexus where various national ambitions converged and diverged. France, a nation with its own deep-seated colonial aspirations and a burgeoning global reach, watched the British actions with keen interest. For years, French merchants had quietly sought to expand their own presence in the lucrative markets of China, often feeling constrained by the dominant British influence. The Second Opium War presented a unique opportunity, a chance to align themselves with a powerful ally and, in doing so, to advance their own interests. The quiet, persistent whispers among French diplomats and industrialists spoke of expanded trade routes, new concessions, and a bolstering of French prestige in East Asia. It was not just about solidarity with Britain, it was a pragmatic calculation. The Arrow incident and the subsequent British retaliation provided France with a convenient pretext to join the fray. While the British grievances were primarily commercial and linked to the Arrow, France cited a separate, though related, incident, the execution of a French missionary, Father Auguste Chapdelaine, in Guangxi province in 1856. This act, seen as a violation of existing agreements protecting missionaries, offered France a moral justification for intervention. It was a quiet indignation that provided a perfect complement to Britain's perceived affront. And so, a formal alliance was forged, a partnership that would see French and British forces marching side by side. The shared objective was not only to punish China for its perceived transgressions, but also to pry open its ancient doors even wider, to unlock its vast resources and markets for the benefit of their respective empires. The glint of their combined military might, even from afar, cast a long, strategic shadow. Meanwhile, across the vast Pacific, the United States maintained a cautious, pragmatic stance. While American merchants had also been active in China, engaged in the lucrative tea and silk trade, and had experienced their own share of frustrations with Qing officialdom, their diplomatic approach had historically differed from that of the European powers. Early in the conflict, American naval vessels had been involved in minor skirmishes around Canton, demonstrating a willingness to protect their citizens and interests. However, as the conflict escalated, the United States deliberately chose a path of neutrality. This decision was not born of indifference, but of a careful calculation. The young American Republic was grappling with its own immense internal divisions, issues that would soon erupt into the brutal crucible of the Civil War. Its focus was turning inward, towards its own continental expansion and the simmering tensions between North and South. Furthermore, the U.S. had achieved many of its desired trading rights through the Treaty of Wanghia in 1844, without resorting to the same level of military aggression as Britain. They preferred to leverage diplomacy and the most favored nation clause, which ensured they received any trading privileges granted to other nations. So, while American warships occasionally shadowed the European fleets, a quiet understanding prevailed. America would not formally engage in this war. They would observe, protect their own, and ultimately seek to benefit from the concessions wrung out by others, without expending their own blood and treasure. It was a quiet strategy of watchful waiting, a pragmatic approach to power. And then there was Russia, a colossal empire stretching across the Eurasian landmass, always playing a longer game. Russia had its own distinct ambitions in East Asia, primarily focused on securing warm water ports and expanding its influence in the vast, sparsely populated regions bordering China. However, direct military involvement in the Opium War was not in its immediate interest. Instead, Russia chose a path of astute diplomacy. While Britain and France were embroiled in costly military campaigns, Russia's representatives engaged in quiet, persistent negotiations with the beleaguered Qing court. They offered a semblance of mediation, a friendly ear, and subtle pressure, all while meticulously advancing their own territorial claims. Through a series of cleverly negotiated treaties, such as the Treaty of Aigun in 1858 and the Treaty of Beijing in 1860, Russia managed to secure vast tracts of land along the Amur and Ussuri rivers, effectively expanding its Siberian frontier southward, without firing a single shot in the Opium War itself. It was a masterclass in opportunistic diplomacy, a quiet expansion achieved through the strategic exploitation of China's weakness, the silent movement of boundary markers on maps, often unnoticed amidst the thunder of distant cannons, nevertheless reshaped the geopolitical landscape of East Asia, proving that not all victories are won on the battlefield. The year 1857 dawned with a quiet, almost ominous sense of purpose for the Anglo-French forces massing along the coast of China. The diplomatic maneuvers and political debates had concluded. Now, it was the cold, hard logic of military might that would speak. And what a stark contrast that might presented. On one side, the majestic European fleets, spearheaded by their technological marvels, the steam ironclads. These were vessels of unprecedented power, their hulls forged of iron, impervious to the cannonballs that would splinter traditional wooden ships, their engines belching smoke and propelling them with a speed and independence from wind that was revolutionary. They represented the vanguard of industrial warfare, a quiet symbol of a new era. On the other side, the venerable Chinese Navy, composed primarily of wooden junks. These were ships rooted in centuries of tradition, agile and effective in their own context, but utterly outmatched by the new behemoths. One could almost feel the weight of history in their timbers, hear the creak of their ancient sails, a stark and somber contrast to the hum of the steam engines. When these two forces met, the outcome was tragically predictable. The British and French steam ironclads, with their superior firepower, range, and armor, simply crushed the Chinese wooden junks. It was less a battle and more a systematic demolition. The roar of the ironclad's guns would reverberate across the water, followed by the sickening splintering of wood, the cries of despair, and the slow, agonizing descent of ancient vessels into the murky depths. The air would fill with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning wood, a testament to the brutal efficiency of modern warfare. The sheer technological chasm made any true contest impossible, transforming naval engagements into swift, devastating displays of European dominance. With control of the waterways firmly secured, the Anglo-French forces turned their attention to the heart of the conflict in the South Canton. The city, a sprawling, densely populated hub of commerce and culture, had already suffered from previous bombardments, but now, the Allies planned a full-scale assault, a methodical siege designed to compel its surrender. Throughout the latter half of 1857, the pressure mounted. The city's inhabitants, once accustomed to the familiar rhythms of trade, now lived under the quiet shadow of foreign guns. They heard the distant thud of artillery, the persistent movements of enemy troops, and felt the tightening noose of encirclement. By late 1857, the city of Canton finally fell to the Anglo-French forces. The ancient walls, which had protected the city for centuries, could no longer withstand the relentless barrage. The moment of its capture was likely not a dramatic, single explosion, but a quiet, creeping infiltration, followed by the inevitable sounds of occupation, the foreign languages echoing in the streets, the unfamiliar uniforms marching through the ancient thoroughfares, the subtle shift in the city's pulse, the feeling of vulnerability of a once impenetrable fortress now laid bare, settled over its inhabitants. Central to the city's defense, and indeed to the entire Chinese resistance in the south, was Governor Ye Ming-chen. He was a figure of unwavering resolve, steadfast in his anti-foreign stance, and deeply committed to upholding Qing sovereignty. He had been the one to order the seizure of the arrow, the incident that had sparked this renewed conflict. For him, the defense of Canton was a matter of profound principle, a quiet, internal battle against the encroachment he so deeply disdained. However, with the city's fall, his position became untenable. In a quiet but deeply humiliating moment, Governor Ye Ming-chen was captured by the Allied forces. One can imagine the quiet shock in the eyes of his captors when they discovered him, not leading a final charge, but perhaps in a secluded room, seemingly resigned to his fate. His capture was a symbolic victory for the Allies, removing a key obstacle to their demands. His subsequent fate was equally telling. He was exiled to India, a British possession, effectively removing him from any position of influence and ensuring he would not stir further resistance. The journey itself, a long, quiet passage across the ocean, must have been a profound reflection of his personal defeat, a silent testament to the vastness of the imperial power he had so fiercely opposed. The fall of Canton and the capture of its resolute governor marked a significant turning point in the war, signaling to China that the European powers were determined to achieve their objectives, no matter the cost. The quiet hum of the humid summer air in Tianjin in 1858 settled upon the treaty negotiations like a heavy shroud. After the decisive military victories in the south, particularly the fall of Canton, the time had come for China to face the bitter consequences at the negotiating table. The Treaty of Tianjin, signed by representatives of the Qing dynasty and the victorious Western powers, was not a negotiation among equals, but rather a solemn, almost silent imposition of terms upon a defeated nation. The scratch of quills on parchment in that quiet room marked not just the signing of a document, but the deepening of China's unwilling integration into a new, Western-dominated world order. The treaty's clauses were far-reaching and deeply humiliating for the Qing court. Imagine the quiet despair of the Chinese officials, their faces perhaps impassive, but their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they were surrendering. Among the most significant concessions was the opening of several more treaty ports, adding to those already established. These new ports, strategically located along China's coastline and even along its internal waterways, were like new, gaping wounds in the ancient fabric of the empire. Each port, a hub of foreign trade and extraterritorial jurisdiction, became a quiet, bustling island of European influence, where foreign laws prevailed and foreign goods flooded in. From Hankou on the Yangtze River to Newchwang in the north, these ports represented a significant expansion of Western access, transforming the quiet rhythm of local life with the unfamiliar sounds of foreign merchants and the new smells of international commerce. Beyond trade, the treaty enforced free movement for foreigners throughout China's interior. This was a truly profound shift. No longer confined to the treaty ports, missionaries, merchants, and even adventurous travelers could now venture freely across the vast Chinese landscape, once forbidden territory. One can imagine the quiet apprehension, and perhaps curiosity, of local villagers encountering these foreign figures. Their different dress, their strange customs, their often zealous beliefs. This freedom of movement, though seemingly innocuous, chipped away at China's sovereignty, allowing foreign ideas and influences to seep into the very heart of the empire, disrupting the quiet traditions of centuries. It also laid the groundwork for future conflicts, as the presence of foreigners in the interior often led to clashes with local authorities and populations. The Treaty of Tianjin was not signed with just Britain and France, but also included the United States and Russia. Even though the latter two had not been direct military participants in the recent fighting, this multi-party agreement underscored the unified pressure exerted by the Western powers. Britain, of course, secured extensive new trading rights, cementing its commercial dominance. Its merchants, once frustrated by limited access, could now envision a vast, untapped market. France likewise gained significant commercial advantages, fulfilling its quieter ambitions for economic expansion in the region, particularly for its burgeoning textile and luxury goods industries. The United States, having adopted a neutral stance in the fighting, shrewdly leveraged the most favored nation clause from its earlier treaties. This allowed American merchants to automatically enjoy all the new privileges and concessions granted to Britain and France, securing economic benefits without the cost of war. It was a quiet triumph of diplomacy for the Americans, demonstrating their astute approach to international relations. Perhaps one of the most remarkable outcomes of the Treaty of Tianjin, and the subsequent negotiations that capitalized on China's weakness, was the territorial gains made by Russia. While Britain and France were embroiled in the direct military conflict, Russia, as we've noted, pursued a quiet, strategic diplomatic offensive, leveraging its position as a non-belligerent friend to China and employing careful negotiation tactics. Russia secured immense new territories. These included vast tracts of land north of the Amur River and east of the Ussuri River, effectively expanding the Russian Far East. These were often remote, sparsely populated regions, but strategically vital, providing Russia with new access to the Pacific coast. The quiet, almost invisible drawing of new lines on maps in distant European chanceries had profound and lasting consequences for the geography and sovereignty of East Asia. The ink on the Treaty of Tianjin, therefore, marked not just the end of a conflict, but the quiet beginning of a new chapter of vulnerability for China. A chapter where its sovereignty would be increasingly, and often subtly, eroded by the relentless tides of foreign ambition. As the summer of 1858 gave way to a more temperate autumn, a fragile, almost hopeful quiet descended upon China. The Treaty of Tianjin had been signed. The immediate hostilities had ceased, and there was a quiet, lingering hope that perhaps the worst was over. Yet, beneath this veneer of peace, deep resentment simmered. The Qing court, particularly Emperor Xianfeng, viewed the concessions extracted at Tianjin as deeply humiliating, a direct assault on the dignity of his empire. The idea of foreign envoys presenting themselves directly at the Forbidden City, as the treaty stipulated, was anathema, a violation of centuries of established protocol where all foreign representatives were treated as tributaries. In 1859, the time came for the formal ratification of the Treaty of Tianjin, a process that required Western envoys to travel to Beijing. Imagine the quiet determination of the British and French representatives as they set out, expecting a dignified, if somewhat tense, ceremony. They approached the ancient capital with an air of diplomatic formality, intending to assert their new rights. However, the Qing authorities had made a quiet but firm decision. They would not allow the envoys to enter Beijing via the direct, customary route, which traditionally implied a status of equality. Instead, they insisted on a circuitous route to the north, and a demand that the envoys disembark their ships and proceed overland. A deliberate act designed to diminish their status and assert Chinese superiority. This seemingly minor dispute over protocol quickly escalated into a grave diplomatic crisis. The Western envoys, interpreting the Qing's actions as a deliberate snub and a violation of the spirit of the treaty, attempted to force their way through the Dagu forts, guarding the approach to Beijing via the Hai River. What followed was a swift and brutal confrontation. The Chinese garrison, under the command of the resolute Mongol general Senge Rinchen, unleashed a fierce bombardment. The roar of Chinese cannons, once underestimated, now thundered, sinking several British gunboats and inflicting heavy casualties on the Anglo-French forces attempting to land. The quiet certainty of Western superiority was momentarily shattered. But the true tragedy, the event that would irrevocably poison the well of diplomacy, occurred later. In a deeply disturbing act, some of the Western envoys and their escort, including British negotiator Harry Parkes, who had been instrumental in sparking the conflict, were captured by Qing forces. What followed was a period of horrific mistreatment. These diplomats, once shielded by international custom, were arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to brutal torture. They endured starvation, psychological torment, and physical abuse. One can almost hear the quiet desperation, the low moans, the chilling silence of their suffering within the confines of their captivity. Many of them, including some British and French soldiers and Indian sepoys who had been part of the escort, succumbed to the horrific conditions and died. News of the torture and deaths of the envoys sent shockwaves through the British and French public. The initial quiet anger that had simmered after the Arrow incident now erupted into righteous fury. For the British particularly, this was not just a violation of diplomatic immunity. It was seen as irrefutable proof of China's inherent barbarism, a justification for the most extreme retaliation. The narrative of Chinese backwardness and cruelty, long cultivated by imperialists like Palmerston, was now seemingly confirmed by this act of unimaginable brutality. The quiet outrage transformed into a hardened resolve, a grim determination for vengeance. Even the Earl of Elgin, the British High Commissioner to China, who had initially harbored reservations about the morality of the war and had sought a more diplomatic resolution, was now utterly committed to retaliation. The quiet skepticism that had once guided his approach vanished, replaced by a steely, unyielding resolve. The broken seal of diplomacy, marred by the blood and suffering of the envoys, ensured that the war, far from ending, was about to enter its most destructive and punitive phase. The quiet hopes for peace were extinguished, replaced by the chilling certainty of impending vengeance. With diplomatic avenues brutally severed and the echoes of suffering reverberating across the oceans, the Anglo-French response was swift, decisive, and chillingly methodical. The air in the summer of 1860, humid and heavy, carried the rhythmic tramp of thousands of marching boots as the combined Anglo-French armies began their relentless advance northwards. Their ultimate destination, Beijing, the very heart of the Qing Empire. This was no longer just about trade or concessions. It was about retribution, about demonstrating the undeniable power of the Western nations. The march was a testament to modern military organization. Their columns moved with a quiet, disciplined efficiency, a stark contrast to the often more traditional, less centralized Chinese forces. Along their route, they encountered a series of fortified positions, obstacles designed to impede their progress and protect the capital. Yet, one by one, these forts were systematically captured. The sound of their heavy artillery, precise and devastating, would shatter the quiet morning air, followed by the shouts of battle and the inevitable, crushing defeat of the defenders. Each fallen fort was not just a strategic victory, it was another step closer to Beijing, another layer of defense peeled away, signaling the growing vulnerability of the once impenetrable Forbidden City. The most significant confrontation on their approach to Beijing occurred at the Battle of Palikao, fought on September 21, 1860. Palikao, a bridge over the Tonghui River, just a few miles east of Beijing, was a crucial defensive position, a final attempt by the Qing forces to bar the way to their capital. Here, a large Chinese army, commanded by the formidable Prince Senge Rinchen, who had previously repulsed the Allies at Dagu forts, made its stand. Imagine the vastness of the Qing army, their colorful banners fluttering in the wind, their ranks stretching across the plain, outnumbering the Allied forces. They fought with courage and desperation, their ancient traditions of warfare clashing head-on with the cold, efficient machinery of modern European armies. The battle itself was a devastatingly one-sided affair. The Anglo-French forces, though significantly outnumbered, possessed overwhelming technological superiority. Their Enfield rifles, firing with greater accuracy and speed, decimated the Chinese ranks. Their artillery, long range and precise, shredded defensive formations. The quiet, disciplined volley fire of the Allied infantry stood in stark contrast to the less organized charges of the Qing cavalry and infantry, armed with antiquated matchlocks and swords. The air would have been thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the cries of battle, and the thud of cannonballs tearing through flesh and earth. The outcome was a brutal tragedy for the Qing. The Allied forces suffered remarkably few casualties, approximately 50 soldiers wounded or killed. In horrifying contrast, the Qing casualties numbered over 1,000, a devastating testament to the disparity in arms and tactics. The silence that fell over the battlefield after the last shots were fired was heavy with the weight of unimaginable loss, a quiet echo of a dying order. News of the catastrophic defeat at Palikao sent a wave of panic through the Forbidden City. Emperor Xianfeng, confronted with the imminent threat to his capital and his own person, made a fateful decision. He fled Beijing, abandoning his palace and his people, seeking refuge in the Imperial Hunting Lodge at Jehol, about 150 miles northeast of the city. His flight was a profound act of abandonment, a quiet admission of defeat, and it left the imperial capital leaderless and vulnerable. The whispers of his departure would have spread quickly, sowing despair among the populace. In his stead, Emperor Xianfeng left his younger brother, Prince Gong, to negotiate with the approaching Allied armies. Prince Gong was a pragmatic and intelligent statesman, burdened with the monumental task of salvaging what he could from the wreckage of defeat. His was a quiet, desperate mission to prevent the utter destruction of Beijing. With no military option left, and the emperor gone, the city was defenseless. And so, in a moment of solemn, quiet resignation. Beijing opened its gates to the Allied forces. The tramp of foreign boots on the ancient cobblestones of the capital marked not just a military occupation, but the profound humiliation of a once mighty empire, now at the mercy of foreign powers. The shadow of conflict had truly fallen upon the heart of China. Upon entering Beijing, the victorious Anglo-French forces found themselves confronted not with immediate resistance, but with a city gripped by a quiet, terrified resignation. The grand prize lay before them, but the true object of the Allies' retribution, the physical manifestation of China's perceived barbarism and the site of the envoy's torture, was yet to be found. That site, that symbol of Qing imperial power and aesthetic splendor, was the Yuanming Yuan, or the Old Summer Palace. Imagine, if you can, a place of unimaginable beauty and serenity. The Summer Palace was not a single building, but a vast complex of meticulously designed gardens, lakes, pavilions, temples, and palaces, stretching over several square miles outside Beijing's walls. It was a centuries-old testament to Chinese architectural brilliance and artistic achievement, a tranquil haven for emperors, filled with priceless treasures, exquisite porcelain, ancient bronzes, rare silks, jade sculptures, magnificent paintings, and countless unique artifacts. Every corner of it whispered tales of imperial grandeur and scholarly refinement. The air there would have been thick with the scent of ancient wood, delicate blossoms, and the quiet hum of nature. However, this sanctuary of beauty was about to face a horrifying desecration. As the Allied soldiers poured into the complex, discipline, already strained by the march and the thrill of victory, crumbled. What began as a systematic search for the captured envoys who, tragically, were found to have been moved, and many had died in custody, quickly devolved into an uncontrolled frenzy of looting. The quiet, disciplined advance gave way to the sounds of chaos, the crash of porcelain, the tearing of silk, the splintering of ancient furniture, the shouts of soldiers discovering riches. No corner of the vast palace complex was spared. Priceless cultural treasures, accumulated over centuries, were plundered without remorse, often smashed in the rush to find more portable valuables. Many artifacts that could not be easily carried were simply destroyed in an act of wanton vandalism. The cultural loss was immense, a quiet tragedy unfolding amidst the clamor of greed. But the ultimate act of destruction was yet to come. Once the fate of the captured envoys was confirmed, that many had died from the brutal torture they endured. The Earl of Elgin, though previously hesitant to engage in such acts, made a grim and chilling decision. He ordered the Summer Palace to be burned to the ground. This was not a random act of vengeance by individual soldiers. It was a deliberate, calculated act of state-sanctioned retribution. The rationale was clear: to inflict a punishment so severe and symbolically significant that it would forever teach the Qing dynasty the consequences of violating international law and harming foreign envoys. It was meant to be a wound to the very heart of the empire, a scar that would never fully heal. On October 18, 1860, the inferno began. Imagine the horrifying spectacle: flames leaping hundreds of feet into the autumn sky, consuming ancient timber and exquisite artwork, casting an ominous glow over Beijing. The scent of burning wood, smoke, and shattered dreams filled the air. A silent lament. For 2 agonizing days, the magnificent Yuanming Yuan burned, its irreplaceable treasures reduced to ash and rubble. The quiet, sacred spaces of the imperial family, the very embodiment of Chinese cultural pride, were utterly annihilated. This act remains one of the most infamous acts of cultural destruction in modern history. The burning of the Summer Palace was a brutal testament to the destructive power of unchecked imperial might and the horrifying consequences of vengeance. It was not merely the destruction of property. It was an assault on China's very soul, a deliberate attempt to erase a piece of its heritage. The quiet sorrow that permeates the air around the ruins of the palace, even today, is a silent echo of the beauty that was lost, and the irreparable damage inflicted upon a civilization. As the acrid smell of smoke still lingered over the ruins of the Summer Palace, signaling a profound and irreparable loss, the final act of this somber drama unfolded. In October 1860, with Beijing under foreign occupation and the emperor in distant exile, Prince Gong, burdened by the immense weight of his nation's defeat, was forced to sign the Treaty of Beijing. This treaty was not a fresh negotiation, but rather a confirmation and amplification of the concessions previously extracted at Tianjin, a quiet hammer blow solidifying China's subjugation. The Treaty of Beijing confirmed all the provisions of the Treaty of Tianjin, reiterating the opening of more treaty ports, the freedom of movement for foreigners, and the right of foreign legations to reside permanently in Beijing. But it went further, adding new layers of humiliation and imposition. Imagine the solemnity in the room, the quiet resignation of the Chinese delegation, knowing they had little leverage left. New clauses were added, significantly increasing the reparations China was compelled to pay to Britain and France. These reparations, measured in millions of ounces of silver, represented a colossal economic burden, a silent drain on the Qing treasury that would hinder China's development for decades. The flow of silver, once desired by China, now flowed outward in a steady, quiet stream, a financial artery slowly being drained. Beyond the economic strictures, the treaty also formalized further territorial cessions. Russia, ever the shrewd diplomat, saw its quiet machinations bear more fruit. Through a separate supplementary treaty, ratified during this period of Chinese weakness, Russia confirmed its acquisition of more land in the Far East, specifically the Ussuri territory. This region, strategically important as a gateway to the Pacific, had been skillfully secured by Russia without a single shot fired in the Opium War. The quiet drawing of new lines on maps in distant chanceries once again reshaped the vast Asian continent. Meanwhile, Britain also expanded its territorial holdings, acquiring the southern part of the Kowloon Peninsula adjacent to Hong Kong, further solidifying its presence and control in the strategically vital Pearl River Delta. These territorial adjustments, quiet acts on paper, nevertheless had profound implications for China's sovereignty and its future geopolitical landscape. Most significantly, the Treaty of Beijing compelled China to open wider to foreign trade than ever before. New ports were designated, new waterways opened to foreign vessels, and the internal customs system was further reshaped to facilitate foreign commerce. This meant not just the flow of goods, but the steady influx of foreign ideas, institutions, and influences that would gradually erode the traditional fabric of Chinese society. One can almost hear the quiet, incessant hum of foreign machinery, the unfamiliar accents in the marketplaces, the subtle shift in the economic rhythms of once isolated communities. The ancient doors, once carefully guarded, were now forced wide open, irreversibly altering China's economic and social landscape. The combined impact of the two Opium Wars, culminating in the Treaty of Beijing, served as a stark and undeniable demonstration of European dominance in East Asia. The quiet era of China's perceived imperial supremacy was definitively over. The Western powers had not only asserted their military and economic might, but had effectively established a system of unequal treaties that would govern China's foreign relations for nearly a century. This system, built on the principle of extraterritoriality and the erosion of Chinese sovereignty, painted a clear picture of who held the power in this new global order. It was a silent, powerful message sent across the world. While the wars bore the name opium, and the drugs trade was indeed a central catalyst, the real, underlying issue was far broader. It was about the forced opening of markets. Opium was merely the most convenient and lucrative tool, the silent key that unlocked China's vast consumer base for Western goods and raw materials. The war was not simply about a drug, it was about free trade, as defined by the West, enforced by superior military technology. It was about smashing open an ancient, self-sufficient empire to integrate it, on Western terms, into the nascent global capitalist system. And so, the quiet moments of diplomacy, the clamor of war, the quiet suffering, and the solemn signing of treaties had redrawn the map of power. The Second Opium War, a series of events marked by both grand strategy and personal tragedy, concluded not with a definitive end, but with the quiet unfolding of a new era for China, an era of vulnerability, of reluctant engagement with the wider world, and of a long, arduous journey towards reclaiming its sovereignty. The questions raised by these events, about power, trade, and the clash of civilizations, continue to echo softly, inviting us to reflect on the intricate dance of history.